This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on social media and use the hashtag London Housing for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Our main item of business this morning is a discussion on housing for women leaving prison. Before we begin, we have a few short items of business. Can I ask our clerk, Diane Richards, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies have been received today from Assemblymember Lord Bailey, for whom Assemblymember Tyrrell will be substituting, from Assemblymember Small Edwards, for whom Assemblymember Baker will be substituting, and from Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No? Okay. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of October 2024? Can we note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings? Great. And that brings us to our main item of business for today, housing for women leaving prison. Please, and I would like to welcome you all. You're our first panel for the day. I'll just run across the panel and then I'll ask each of you to give a very brief statement just to explain who you are and kind of how you're in this particular field of work. The first guest we have is John Plummer, who's a coordinator at the London Prisons Mission. Natasha Clough, female lead for the Community Accommodation Service, Tier 2, CAS 2, accommodation at NACRO. Sam Julius, who's Head of Influence and Communications at Clinks, and Rachel Ozanne, Director of Programmes and Partnerships, Women in Prison. So if I start first with John, it would be really good to understand a little bit about the London Prisons Mission for those that haven't heard about the organisation.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is John Plummer. I'm coordinator of the London Prisons Mission. And can I begin by also giving apologies for Jonathan French? I spoke to him at length last night about today's meeting, and he said that we were all lined up to meet here. And this morning he telephoned to say that he couldn't come in because of problems at the prison. However, as a very frequent visitor to that prison, as well as others, I'd be happy to try and supplement any answers that Rachel and others might give directed about the prison particularly. I'm delighted that this one-off meeting is taking place. I've personally devoted a huge amount of my time over the last 4 or 5 years to the subject and played a part with Sam Moema, Sian Berry and others in devising the original Safer Homes motion, the first 2 sections of which are directly related to the issue of provision of safe accommodation for women leaving prison and the particular ways in which the Assembly, MOPAC and, I'm very sorry, again, please don't bother, I'll pick it up when I leave, and others can play a part in actually delivering safe homes across Greater London. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Natasha.
Good morning, Natasha Clough. So I am female lead for NACRO CAS 2. I do manage the north of England, so London is not my area of expertise. I do apologise. So the information that I've gathered is from the managers within that area. So it was formerly known as BAS, Bail Accommodation and Support Service. We currently have the available cohorts of bailees and individuals subject to home detention curfew who come into our service.
So can you just explain what CAS accommodation is, please?
Yeah, so it's a commission contract from the Ministry of Justice. So we take low to medium risk offenders coming into supported accommodation.
Hi everyone, my name is Sam Julius. I'm the Head of Influence at Clinks. We're the national infrastructure organisation that represents all the voluntary sector working in the criminal justice space. And the reason I'm here today is that we help co-convene the Reducing Reoffending Third Sector Advisory Group, which is a group of senior leaders in the voluntary sector that is convened to act as the interface between the sector and the MOJ and HMPPS. And every year that group kind of explores specific areas of policy. And last year we looked at the barriers to accessing accommodation for people leaving prison, with quite a large amount of focus on women leaving prison.
And finally, Rachel.
Yeah, hi everyone. So Rachel Ozanne, Director of Programmes and Partnerships at Women in Prison. So Women in Prison is a national charity supporting women in the criminal justice system. So we deliver services to women in prison and in the community, and we use our learning from that to kind of campaign, for change, I guess. So in London, we deliver services in South London and across the 3 women's prisons where London women often are residing. So it's a co-commission contract worked with HMPPS, MOPAC, the NHS and the London Borough of Lambeth. So we're able, in essence, to provide support to women who've been in contact with the criminal justice system at some point within the last 6 months. So that includes a team working with remanded women in Bronzefield as well as kind of sentence pre-release. So that's what we'll be talking to you today.
Thank you all so much. Before I start with questions, Natasha, do you mind picking up your mic from the base and pulling it forward a little? Thank you. I couldn't hear you very well at the outset. So my first question then is to Sam and Natasha and then Jonathan. And it's just really to get a bit of a view from you on what the current housing situation is for women leaving prison and returning to London. We had a visit to Bronzefield a few weeks ago, and it was, I think we were struggling to get a sense of numbers and, you know, whether people were returners or whether it was kind of lots of, you know, that kind of, to get a handle on the scale. So for irrespective of the numbers, though, just kind of what the situation for those women is if they're returning to London. And just really from your professional experience, how their lives are affected by a lack of housing and housing support. And if I just wanted to add that we had the privilege to speak to some prisoners there, and one concern was around women-only spaces for people, particularly when they were I don't really have the language, I apologise, but kind of when they were coming out and were trying to re-enter the community, that was something that was lacking and really affected their reintegration. So if we could start there, that'd be really great.
Yes, in terms of numbers, I think I don't have the exact numbers of women coming out into London. From our service, so from April to September, so 6 months, we worked with 323 women on remand. 203 of those were referrals around accommodation. The numbers of remanded women is rocketing. So, I mean, and I think at one point at Bronzefield there was sort of 70% remanded women. And that presents masses of challenges because some of the pathways for women coming out of their sentence, like CAS 3 accommodation, so temporary accommodation for 84 days, doesn't apply to remanded women or women on sort of short recalls as well. So that's a particular issue that I wanted to highlight in terms of the kind of volume of women on remand. Sentenced women is interesting. I think I had a look. So again, in the same 6-month period, we received a total of 576 referrals. So 323 of those were remanded women. The rest being sentenced, so 253. Only 16 referrals came to us for pre-release support around accommodation. So that would be 16 women that were in custody. So the pathway is we should get a referral for a sentenced woman 12 weeks, up to 12 weeks before she's released. So that's really important that we get that referral as quickly as possible to start kind of, looking at what the sort of support needs are, working with probation around those options. So I think there's a real gap there around getting that timely referral for women before they're coming out to London. But in terms of what they're coming out to, it does vary across the boroughs. So we are just seeing a mix of what... So I think a predominant issue, which you'll have heard before, is that women have multiple needs. So in our data, the most common number of needs we're supporting women around is 5. So where there's accommodation, and then the most common additional issues are domestic abuse, mental and physical health, finance, benefit and debt issues, and then kind of potentially parental issues, immigration, those other issues. So the way that we support women is kind of assessing all of their needs and then kind of working out a kind of support plan and what they need. So it's what the options are around accommodation. So sometimes going into temporary accommodation is not suitable. It needs to be a supported accommodation. But across the boroughs, that really varies as to what those options are. And I think... And you'll hear a lot about the sort of safe and suitable accommodation. Of course, that's a focus today, and I think that's a real gap around what is that. So, you know, women will talk about needing to be in single-sex accommodation. That's quite limited. So quite often that might be going into, say, a mixed hostel where women don't feel safe. So I think it really varies across the boroughs. It's not consistent depending on where that woman's coming out to London, I would say.
OK, thank you. Sam, Natasha, and then we'll come to you, John. A slightly different question.
Yeah, just picking up on what Rachel said. What we found through the work of the RR3 was that the issue of settled accommodation was a particularly big issue.
So by settled, you mean permanent accommodation?
Permanent accommodation, yes. In terms of the numbers of people being released from prison homeless, the figure's pretty similar when you compare men and women, but the figure is lower for women when they mark it at the 3-month post-release point. What the government has done is they've attempted to kind of plug that gap somewhat through the provision of CAS 3 accommodation, which is a different tier to the CAS 2 that Natasha was talking about, and that essentially provides up to 84 nights of accommodation from that first night of release. But the problem that you have is kind of twofold. There is an issue post 84 nights of where that woman will go, because it's a wider societal challenge, as you guys will know. There is just a distinct lack of affordable accommodation. And the second issue is that a lot of women going into these spaces don't fulfill the criteria for CAS 3. Essentially, they're too unwell to be taken in by CAS 3. There isn't the level of support required in order for them to successfully be placed in CAS 3 provision. So their options are somewhat limited. If you look beyond CAS 3 accommodation and a woman's come out of prison and going straight into local authority accommodation, you have that real difficulty with the priority need classifications that councils use. There is no uniform definition that is applied objectively across all boroughs. So many women aren't being deemed as having priority need, even though there's a statutory obligation to classify someone's priority need if they've suffered from domestic abuse. So we've heard of many women not being classified despite having been sufferers of domestic abuse, which further kind of limits their choices.
Thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, so within CAS 2, so we take females on home detention curfew or will be subject on bail whilst they await the court period. What we find in London is CAS 2 has got limited availability, so we've got 5 properties, female properties across London on the CAS 2 contract.
Can I just ask you, so first of all, can you just push the,
Yeah.
Okay, that's better. And so you say you have 5 properties in London. How many, I guess, bed spaces is that, and for how long
So
for?
it's 2 to 3 bed spaces per property. Strictly females, we don't mix the properties, so that'd be sort of 10 to 15 bed spaces across London for females. Sorry, what was your next question?
I was just trying to get a sense of how
sorry.
much is on offer. So 2 to 3, and there's 5. That's not very much at all.
5 properties across London. So they're only eligible for the term of the home detention curfew, so at the point that expires, they're not eligible for our service anymore, so we need to do move-on work quite quickly. So we work collaboratively with the probation service. We would expect them to do the duty to refer within 72 hours. We would then work alongside with an accommodation plan to look to find that female settled accommodation at the point that they leave us, so that they don't leave us homeless.
Before I come to you, John, Sam, you mentioned CAS 3. Natasha is, because we heard CAS 2 mentioned at Bronzefield when we were there, but if the actual number is only 15 units, which is virtually, it's not anything really, to kind of make a dent in the issue, I just wonder what's the number of bed spaces that CAS 3 offers? Because I guess I can't speak for others, but I don't understand the scale of this problem and what's is there any meaningful attempt to address having safe places for women to sleep?
So in terms of the numbers, CAS 3 was fully mobilised nationally at the end of 2023, and it has now, between July 21 and March 24, it has placed just over 12,000 people in CAS 3 properties, of which I think it was something like 6%, so less than 1,000 were women. They have provided for 10% of bed spaces via CAS 3 to be set aside for women.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. So, John, is there, in your experience, any variation? Sorry, start again. Is there any variation in experience faced by women leaving prison based on the London boroughs that they're returning to? So, yeah.
Yes, there's a fundamental difference. Beginning this exercise in 2017-18, we actually went around all the London boroughs, either by post or 21 of them in person, and interviewed the senior management and the officers responsible for resettlement, and found generally the standard was very poor. Most of them had no processes for actually receiving applications in respect of a woman shortly to be released at all. And many of them actually said, well, are you really suggesting we should give these women priority over things like domestic violence and other emergency cases? And we say, but just a minute, these women have largely been victims of domestic violence, and that's actually part of their offending behaviour, so let's get that right, which surprised them because they hadn't done much work on this. The exception was Lambeth Borough, where they actually have a person with the title Prisons Navigator, Prisons Release Navigator, which is a bit actually it could be impressive, but it actually is, because it does deliver. There are processes for receiving applications. The fact that that is so much better than saying, sorry, we won't even consider them until they're walking through the gate, is just enormous, because that is too damn late for these very vulnerable women. Now, the other thing is that we recognise in all our work with London authorities that there is an intense pressure on social and affordable housing across the piece. So there's no good pretending that this ought to be treated completely separately and is outside that. There is a chronic problem, and of course we have to fit into that. We are talking now about, you're talking about numbers, Sam, 50 women per month released to homelessness, which results in danger and destitution. Now that is exactly the same number, in round figures, as was the case when we started and when we published the report which has been circulated as part of your package. I am deeply ashamed of the fact that we have made no improvement in that. There have been improvements in some respects, like the CAS accommodation that colleagues have talked about, but those are not reaching the subject. They're not reaching the special and fundamental different needs of women in these circumstances. It is still a problem about this difference, because I well recall going to talk to ministers and others years ago, and whenever I mentioned the subject of women, they would say, but just a minute, they're only 4% of the prison population. Surely you're not suggesting I should devote time to that instead of the 96%. You know, it was a different problem.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Boff.
Do you think, you've alluded to the huge variation there is between boroughs, generally, and you said it's generally a poor message that's going on there. Do you think there'd be a consistent London-wide housing pathway for women leaving prison, rather than trying to funnel people through the existing system? Would that be a progress?
Andrew, I would love to be able to dictate what the rules are to every London borough, and indeed, incidentally, every other local authority in the UK surrounding a women's prison. That is obviously not realistic, as you know, even better than I do. But nonetheless, what we can do is, through this body, is to implement things like the Women's Prison Release Practice Briefing, which is very good. It arose from the work that we did to devise a protocol for women leaving prison, which set out some of the basic procedures that should be followed. Now, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't provide the bricks and mortar. That's a separate exercise which we can move on to. But establishing appropriate processes for receiving and considering applications in respect of women leaving prison is feasible.
Do you think the Mayor has a role in that?
I'm absolutely sure that the Mayor has a role in it. In one respect, in terms of leadership, because as you know, the Mayor, by virtue of his post, as well as at the present time, the personality, has very substantial leadership skills, and he could certainly, in collaboration with London councils and G15, support the implementation of the Women's Prison Release Practice Briefing, and that would make a substantial difference.
And just finally on the supplementaries, if that's okay, Do you think the Mayor should appoint a dedicated liaison officer, somebody who is able to tie up with the London boroughs and the G15 and other partners in order to put this
I'm quite sure he should, and I believe that to come not only under the responsibilities of the Assembly, but also his responsibilities as Police and Crime Commissioner, Commissioner for Police and Crime, wrong way round, which really is very vital, because those people have a role of reducing reoffending, and clearly this has a direct relevance to women being released from prison homeless. So yes, he should have that, and I would, if I may now, relate that to the new Women's Justice Board, which is about to be established under the chairmanship of James Timpson, a very keen supporter of your motion, and therefore, yes, it should make a difference. I'd like the Mayor also to be asking for a place on the Women's Justice Board.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Well, I do actually. One more. I'll test your indulgence. Yes. One of the things you alluded to, Mr. Plummer, is that you said that local authorities were not willing to engage with a person who is going to be homeless unless they walk through the door. Now, the Homelessness Reduction Act kind of says that's not what we should be doing, that we should be anticipating homelessness. How is what they're doing not illegal?
The duty to refer under that Act does not specify women leaving prison as closely as we think it should be. I've discussed this with Bob Blackman, who you remember was the MP who proposed the Homelessness Reduction Act, and he actually wrote to the Mayor supporting his implication of the Safer Homes motion as being a step in that direction. It might benefit from minor change under a statutory instrument to that, requiring women leaving prison to be treated as a priority group. But apart from that, it can certainly be used, and again, the encouragement and leadership of the Assembly would help in that direction.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. My next question is to Rachel and John. What are the barriers to safe and secure accommodation for women leaving prison that face additional challenges? So thinking about how the example of single mums, women with a history of substance misuse, and women who are either victims or survivors of domestic violence, how they're uniquely affected, just the barriers to them kind of leaving that life, if you like, and just how that stops them getting accommodation.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. We did a recent consultation with women, so some women in prison and some in our South London hubs. And they talked about how they were viewed, through the lens of their offending rather than around their needs. And I think domestic abuse is a particularly interesting one, because what we're seeing is an increasing number of women being criminalised who are domestic abuse survivors. And I think although people talk about kind of domestic abuse being a common factor for women contributing to their offending, there's something about the cause of the offending that I don't think is recognised in the right way. So as John described, I think then being kind of how a woman's assessed or recognised around that domestic abuse is a massive issue, particularly if there's potentially an issue of they're viewed through the lens of they've used harm, are they the perpetrator, and then when we're doing an assessment it's like they're the victim, they're the survivor in that way, but they're not, it just creates all these different barriers. So I think there's different levels of those barriers, and then it's access to then the sort of safe and suitable accommodation. We have a lot of barriers for women we support accessing domestic abuse services. Certainly refuges is quite challenging. Obviously the number of refuge spaces is low anyway, but getting that right support, and particularly if they've got other needs and coexisting needs like the sort of substance misuse, mental health, then having that kind of supported accommodation that can address those issues. There's just very limited options. So they're the women that we most likely see homeless, where they have those additional needs. And of course, if a woman is trying to kind of get custody of her child back, then that just, that is, barriers in terms of trying to access that right accommodation. And for her to be in that position where she's kind of able to show that she's able to take the children back.
Yes, might I just add, because it's directly relevant to Member Boff's question about the Homelessness Reduction Act. You might be interested to know that we did a whole lot of interviews with MPs whose constituencies contain women's prisons outside London, and a member of the management team of each of those women's prisons. And absolutely fascinating, because those MPs were amazed to find that, again, women were leaving those prisons to homelessness without having the interest of local authorities to which they wish to return after prison. So it's by no means a London problem alone, but we believe that the motion that you've passed already could demonstrate, when implemented, that London is exemplary, and you've adopted, or you've reached, a position of leadership in this. So I do want you to bear in mind that, although, of course, you're talking about London, there are very significant implications for outside London. Also remembering that Bronzefield is the biggest prison, not only in UK, but also in Europe. Therefore, the numbers we're talking about are greater. All those other prisons are only releasing 5, 10, 15, 20 women per month, whereas London is releasing 50 plus to return to resume residence in London.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Boff again.
To Mr. Julius, how are the women's housing outcomes monitored after they leave prison? And is there an effective sharing process amongst different agencies who are supporting them?
The MOJ and HPPS monitor 2 metrics when it comes to people leaving prison. They have housed on the night of release, and then they have housed 3 months post-release. The difficulty we have is it is quite of a challenge to get disaggregated data. So a lot of the numbers that I came with today are about people leaving prison and not specifically women. The second challenge is that in order for prisons to, reach certain benchmarks in terms of people housed on the night of release, they just need to have a roof over their head for 24 hours. And at that point, they're marked as housed on the night of release. That doesn't take into account that they could then be no fixed abode 2 days later. So there are certainly some challenges in terms of the data. I certainly found in preparation for this that the numbers, for example, looking at CAS 2 provision, aren't particularly monitored in a way that enables analysis of the data. CAS 3 is slightly easier, but I think there's a lot to be said for ensuring that there is truly disaggregated data that can show us the scale of the problem, particularly when it comes to homelessness amongst women leaving prison.
So the problem, I'm interested in this because, when we went on that excellent visit to Bronzefield, I talked to some of the women there, some of the prisoners there, and there was almost an inevitability for them that they would come back, consciously, deliberately come back, because that was more secure housing than they were going to get outside the prison. Is that something that you've heard of before?
Yeah, consistently. I think, obviously Clinks isn't a direct delivery charity, but the vast majority of our members are. And everything is weighed against people coming out of prison. There are so many examples you could give as to why women in this instance end up back in prison. So you look at the way that local authorities, the rules govern how they support women. There's the issue around intentionality and whether you have made yourself intentionally homeless and therefore you aren't due the main relief duty as per the HRA. And in many instances we've found women who have refused an offer of a local authority property because it's not close to their children, and as a result they are deemed to have made themselves intentionally homeless, and therefore don't receive the main housing duty. So that's just one instance in terms of the factors that is weighed against them. We've spoken about CAS 3, 12 weeks, but post 12 weeks, where do they go? So in many instances, being in prison is safer and more secure, away from potential perpetrators of domestic abuse. You have a roof over your head, and that's why one of the biggest issues within the current prison overcrowding crisis is the incredibly high level of recalls, because that makes up a large proportion of the prison population, and people are being released and then being recalled, and you see the same people going in and out of prison. So yeah.
And perhaps, Mr. Plummer, you could come in. You're speaking for the governor of Bronsfield as well. Perhaps you could chip in as well, Mr. Julius. When a woman is leaving prison, who is told? Who is communicated with that this person is now going to be out there looking for accommodation, looking for some kind of support? Is there a protocol?
There is not a standard protocol that is actually applied. There are certain arrangements that are made, and certainly the probation service ought to be informed in advance. Bear in mind that a lot of these women are on short sentences, having been convicted of non-violent offences. About 80% of Bronsfield is non-violent offences, and therefore very short sentences. Therefore, there often isn't sufficient time for adequate arrangements to have been made, and you'll be aware that there is about to begin a review of sentences generally, and particularly for women. So that is relevant to this subject. But I can tell you that this week, Bronsfield has a population of 56% remands, 270 or 80 women remanded there. And I personally think that's a separate issue that you should be taken up, because it is impacting very seriously on them and their families, and, of course, their tenancies, if they had an adequate one before they were incarcerated, and their children. So that's important. The other thing, just to add to what Julius was saying, Sam was saying about definitions, it's absolutely extraordinary that the lack of uniform definitions makes it very difficult for us to compare the performance of one local authority or one London borough with another. I recall sitting with people of what was then CRC, but now probation, saying, but this woman was living in a tent before she was convicted, and therefore if we've got released to a tent, surely that counts as suitable. It's suitable. It's what she had before. Now, until we can get uniform definitions, we will not be able to adequately compare performance, and that is important.
Mr. Julius?
I just wanted to add, in terms of the people that are notified of a woman leaving prison, you have these CRS providers, so that's the commissioned rehabilitative services that are commissioned via HMPPS. And with women, it's one uniform pathway. On the men's side, you have 7 separate pathways: housing, employment, etc. But women, it's one holistic pathway, and you'll have different CRS providers in different regions. And those organisations are the ones responsible for supporting women when they come out of prison.
So I don't know if I'm just being a little dense. I don't really understand what you're telling us, in the sense that somebody gets referred. How does that very specifically? Sorry, Andrew.
No.
How does that?
Clarification's good.
What does that person look like if it's the case that there is nobody in a local authority, for example, who knows that this woman is coming out of prison? Or even if they know, they're just like, okay, because they've got other things to do. So that sounded really confrontational. I don't mean it to, but if you could just unpack what it is that, who's being told what exactly and when, because that's just not clear. I know kind of lexicographically, yes, that's happening, but what's the outcome of that?
Well, it's funny that you say that, because one of the biggest issues is that there are, a range of organisations that can support women coming out of prison, statutory and non-statutory, and there is that confusion about who is responsible for what. But you have a system, Refer and Monitor, through which the referral is made into the community. Statutory organisations have an obligation, for example, the duty to refer, and that referral goes through to the CRS provider, and then that CRS provider provides support post-release.
What is the support, though? Is it a place to live? Is it employment support? Do you see what I mean?
So, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so we're the CRS provider for South London, and then it's the organisation Advance for North London, so we deliver the same service. So Sam's right, so for sentenced women coming out, we receive that referral. It's probation's responsibility to do the duty to refer, so they'll be alerting the local authority, and it's our responsibility to then follow up. So we'll be doing that liaison with the local authority, arranging the housing assessment. If we can't find that, trying to source somewhere else for them to go. So that's the responsibilities with us. However, if someone's remanded, there isn't that same. So it's still the responsibility of the kind of prison-based probation services to make that duty to refer. But if someone's remanded, goes to court, released from court, there's a gap there. So we can continue to work with them if we can contact them. So there's a bit of a gap there, I think, around responsibility. So in theory, we are there to provide that support if we are in contact with that woman. And again, recalls is a gap also, I would say. But it's the statutory organisation's responsibility to do the duty to refer, and then the community organisation carries on the work.
Okay. No, you're absolutely. You're in the same line as myself. I'm just trying to get a picture of how this all happens. So, the prison authorities, once the sentence, we're not talking about remand. Once the sentence is complete, the prison authorities notify the probation service. The probation service notify yourselves. Is that correct, or is there a step in between?
No, that's right. So they have, there'll be a kind of prison-based offender manager who kind of looks after somebody whilst they're in custody, and then 12 weeks before they transfer to a community probation practitioner, they do the referral to us. I think the other thing that probation do are resettlement panels. So within that last 12 weeks, ahead of someone coming out in each borough, there is a resettlement panel, and they'll talk about the people that are due to come out. And in theory, you have the the local authority housing teams, ourselves, other kind of organisations in that borough, and that should be the opportunity to pick up any gaps, look at whether is there accommodation found, is CAS 3 needed, that kind of thing. So those resettlement panels, I think they're relatively new, or certainly for a few months, but that's to try and kind of bring the community based and the probation side together.
Thank you very much.
If I may, very briefly, I think the last word is interesting there. These arrangements very new. The fact is that there are ongoing improvements happening here, and that's an indication of them. And also, some of the agencies concerned are doing an outstanding job under very difficult, very demanding circumstances. So I'm not in any way rubbishing them. But the outcome, returning to your original question about what's the effect, is confusion, muddy waters, and considerable anxiety to many of the people involved in actually needing these services. If you talk to some of those women in Bronzefield and other women's prisons, you find that uncertainty is absolutely dominant in their mind. When am I going to be able to start the process safely?
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Garbutt.
Morning. Thank you for your contributions so far. I know we've had lots of contributions about what the challenges are, but my question is about what the key challenges are for local authorities, prison service, probation, and the voluntary sector in providing housing for women. Because what I think these questions are kind of probing is, and I think this links to some of the questions that Assembly Member Boff was asking, is I think we're trying to get to, is there a new service or a new person that's needed, or do we have the services we need, we're just not using them well enough? And I think I'm trying to understand that tension. So yeah, the question is about the key challenges faced by local authority, prison service, probation and voluntary sector in providing housing for women, but I do want to understand how people are still falling through the cracks considering we've got all of these services. I was going to start with, Rachel. Thanks.
Yeah, I think there is a role for something cross-borough. We had a housing knowledge exchange event last week run by MOPAC. So there were some local authorities there, because I think they have different numbers of women coming back to their areas. So I think how they prioritise. So Lambeth is great. They have these specialist roles and they do a really good job. And there's other boroughs doing something similar. There's an issue that the local authorities highlighted about funding. So I think some of the funding for some of their work is through funding that runs out in March. So what's the kind of future of those sorts of options? But I think there was discussion at that event about actually if you could do something cross-borough that helps potentially around capacity and consistency. So I think there's something there about trying to address those inconsistencies. And like John says with the briefing, that does set out some of those kind of key priorities and how to work with women. I think there's definitely a volume issue, and I think there's something. I know you're focusing around women coming out of prison, but actually if we could stop some of the kind of the route into prison. So say take remand, it is part of the reason why someone might be remanded. It might be because of the lack of accommodation. Like John says, like most women in prison are not in for violent offences. Most women on remand, if they do get sentenced, will be a probation order. So actually if we could sort that bit out, then you wouldn't have so many people coming in, and we're seeing those numbers rocket. The same with recall. So the women being recalled, and this is the same nationally, it's often not for committing another offence. It's sort of more administrative, so it might be not turning up to kind of probation appointments, but it could also be not living at the address that they're supposed to be or losing that address. So again, that's kind of playing a factor in some of those numbers that I think needs to be addressed. I mean, one of the women we worked with, she was recalled back to prison because she couldn't go back to her home address because of domestic abuse, and so she was sent back to prison because she'd kind of breached because she wasn't staying where she was supposed to. So that just shouldn't happen. So there's something more kind of like whole systems that I think actually would address those issues around women coming out of prison as well. But I think there is something cross-borough needed.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah, we'll just go to Sam and see what you think.
Thank you. I'm conscious of coming to these types of things and always just laying bare the scale of the challenges as opposed to offering some positivity and some solutions. I completely agree with Rachel. It is, a systems-wide approach, and the focus, and hopefully this will come through the new Women's Justice Board, needs to be on that early intervention, because a lot of the time it's considered a buzzword, but if you focus resources at the front end of the system, you stop people coming in, and then we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation today. For women that are in prison that are coming out, there are some options that we've considered and put forward to the MOJ. For example, you have the Supported Housing Act, which came into effect, I think, in 2022. That regulated supported housing providers because there was an issue with some supported housing providers being particularly unscrupulous. But within that act, there could be the option to obligate local authorities to consider their level of stock so that they could set aside specific levels of supported housing supply so that there was provision for women leaving prison. Because as we've all said today, for a lot of women coming out of prison, there isn't that suitable, distinct accommodation option where they get the level of support they need. Because my final point is we survey the voluntary sector every year, hundreds of organisations, and what we have found is that the complexity and urgency of need of people coming out of prison is ever increasing. And in order to cater for that, you need to fund the voluntary sector because they are providing a vital public service. They're not kind of, that second-class citizen. Without the voluntary sector, there wouldn't be that support that was needed. And by funding them, you can enable those options to be there, whether that's through women's centres or just in general that holistic wraparound support.
Thanks. I did really feel that on the visit to Bronzefield that, that overarching feeling of just how much of this could have been prevented in the first place if we were doing all of this care and, like you mentioned, kind of refuge places and just taking, having those services available earlier. John, I didn't know if you wanted to come in. You mentioned earlier about, I think it was you that mentioned people not being classified in the right way around their needs. And I just your perspective on what the key challenges are. And if you've got anything, I know you've already mentioned the women's release practice briefing, but just any comments you've got about how that's working or not working, any further thoughts on that?
The women's prison release practice briefing is really hardly working at all at the moment because it has not been really seriously publicly launched, which is another reason why I think it's urgent that we should have the Mayor formally inviting the participation of London councils and G15 to work together on a London-wide plan for this, one element of which will be the working of the Women's Prison Release Practice Briefing across Greater London. Obviously, some boroughs more than others, but nonetheless, the arrangement should be London-wide. So that's one. I think it's crucial to note that we have improved some of the options. There is the potential, but the lack of coordination, the lack of linkage, and the lack of London-wide leadership is crucial. So, and that applies to the Prisons Relief Practice Briefing as well. On this issue of recalls and non-compliance, that really is crucial. The fact that so many women are being recalled unnecessarily for an extra 14 days in custody, often again interrupting their childcare responsibilities and so on, is absolutely critical and quite absurd the way that's being done at the moment. And finally, because you're talking about wider issues about recalls, it's interesting to note that one of the things that's happened in the media in the last few months is wider interest in the fact that many people are being released from prison and, would you believe, are being released to homelessness. And some of them are reoffending, and some of them are being recalled. Isn't that outrageous? Now, I'm actually delighted that that's reaching the media and is regularly on TV and so on. And of course it applies to women and continues to apply for women, and their circumstances are different. But the fact that there is that public attention to release to homelessness is actually one of the welcome benefits of the present news.
That was really helpful. I know you've mentioned the Mayor not, there's more the Mayor can do around the women's prison release practice briefing, but I just wondered if there's anything MOPAC had been doing. If you had any, I don't know if anyone wants to comment on anything MOPAC's been doing around the dissemination and communication around.
I'm sorry,
Sam, yeah.
Yes, MOPAC does some valuable work, and one of the things it does, of course, is that it is the lead organisation of the London Blueprint for Women in Contact with the Criminal Justice System, which is a valuable initiative, and many people meet, many delivery agencies, statutory and voluntary, meet regularly to discuss that. Now, that is very important in a whole range of issues concerning women in contact with the criminal justice system. Very important, very useful exchange of information and ideas. But it is not the body charged with actually coordinating London-wide arrangements. And it can't pretend to be. Therefore, that needs to be dealt with separately but informed. So the London-wide collaboration I'm talking about should set up its own plans, have those reported back to you and others so that they can be agreed as a London-wide plan, and there should then be a regular review of those arrangements so that we can all see how's it going and what are the problems and so on. So we need to distinguish those and set clear purposes for the Mayor and the other agencies involved.
Does anyone else want to come in? If not, I'll go back to the chair.
Okay, thank you. Before I hand over to Assembly Member Baker, I just wanted to, whilst I'm following the conversation, and we've had a lot of, as you said, kind of talked about what the issues are, I'm still keep coming back to just a few of you have touched on. So, for example, Sam, you said that data is collected for all people leaving prison and it's not disaggregated to separate women from men. And so there is that, which I don't really then understand how we can come up with a meaningful understanding of what are the numbers of people, of women coming back to London. Your point, Rachel, that you made about women on remand and women coming in and out of prison, because that's a rational choice if you've got nowhere to stay, is to kind of try and get recalled. What I can't, am I explaining? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm not sure if I'm making sense. I think What I'm struggling with is the lack of specificity. I don't understand how we can provide for these women if we don't count them, if we don't know how many of them there are. So if we have maybe one person who is in and out over a period of 6 months, if that is, as we raised at the prison, is that 6 movements? Is that one person? The support, what support is it that is then being asked for that person? I think as we kind of progress through this, and I really would welcome your thoughts and challenge, written or today, on how we could address that and, you know, use the mayor's, kind of recommend to the mayor to use his office to do something meaningful around that. I was, so kind of coming back again, I was very excited to learn about CAS 2, but 15, you know, it's not even touching the sides. And in terms of kind of permanent accommodation that's required, what are the absolute numbers that are needed every month? So John has mentioned 50 women a month. Again, if that's actually only 10 new women every month, is that do you see what I mean? I think that's what I'm trying to work towards. How do we take all that you've been doing and do something specific for London? Bearing in mind, like you said, John, the Mayor of London is also our PCC, so we have that opportunity as well. Rant over. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Baker.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Sorry, thanks. So I wanted to specifically ask about CAS 2 and CAS 3 and what impact they have. I think starting with Natasha. So the introduction of CAS 2 and CAS 3, what has the impact? What impact has that introduction had for women overall, and any sort of specifics that you might have?
Well, we have a specific female offer within CAS 2. Sorry, let me just get my notes.
That's fine.
Apologies. Yeah, so within CAS 2, each female will receive 2 hours of support per week with an allocated female support worker. A lot of the support, it's wraparound support, so we'll, you know, a lot of the focus is on Move On, and then we work collaboratively with other services, so such as probation, substance misuse, mental health, additional finance support. We provide a smartphone to the females when they come into service with us. We also have a discretionary fund within CAS 2, so what we can use that for where we can reach out more to private landlords. So we've got that as an option for deposit schemes and a first month's rent up front. So we've now got that, which is having a really positive impact across the contract. The female properties all have CCTV as well, so we've got that additional safety measure for the females in service as well.
Thank you. And so that all sounds good. Are you seeing yet, and I know it's relatively new, are you seeing an impact yet on the outcomes for women, and or are those outcomes being monitored? And do you have anything sort of substantive yet you can say about how it's positively impacting?
Rachel had said, our outcomes are monitored by the Ministry of Justice, and one of our outcomes is successful Move On. So I did get some data for the past 12 months. Of the 36 females in service, we had 9 of them were moved on successfully. So we were able, and when we say successful, we have to evidence that that person has got an accommodation that they will remain in for over 3 months, and we've got proof of that address, and probation are aware of that as well. So that's how we would measure that. 27 of those females were either breached or absconded from service. So again, where we see recalls and females breaching curfews as such and being recalled back to custody. So it's quite a mixed bag in terms of our
I mean,
success rate.
it's a really difficult space. I don't think anyone would, expect there to be a single, if we just do X, then we solve all the problems these women have over some very difficult circumstances. It's about, making it as easy as possible for them to change their lives as well. So do you have, how does that compare with sort of normal rates of recall or successful moving on? Do you have that information?
I don't, unfortunately.
You don't?
Sorry.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting for us to know, because it's, like I say, one intervention and yeah. John, did you have something to...
Could I just add very briefly? It is, of course, very difficult. You're right about that. I will speak with Jonathan French after this meeting in order to explain lots of things, but also to see if he and I can work out some figures just for Bronzefield relating to the women leaving. How many, in our opinion, left to suitable accommodation? That is not to somebody else's definition, but in our definition. And how many have been recalled of that number? So that I can try to give you the answers to both yours and the Chair's question about specific London things. However, I don't think we should get too locked up with this because of the bad definitions and everything else. And we should just say, look, in London, we know that 50 women a month are leaving. We know that that is 2 or 3 maximum per borough per month, and that's what we ought to be providing for. Now, the fact that because of recalls and all the other things, it might actually be 1 or 2, fine, I'd be delighted. But we can use that number for what is needed.
Yeah. I suppose, and I'll come back to CAS 2 and 3 in a second, in a moment. But John, just to ask you, and I appreciate what you're saying. You're sort of like, look, just act on what we've got, you know. But I'm just wondering if the fact that those figures are a little bit complex might be one of the reasons. Well, no. It seems to me that there should be more joined up effect, because you're all doing your work in your bits and trying to help the women that come across, and all your organisations are doing the same. But where is it being convened? Where's the collaboration being convened? And you know, what would a single process look like? And just that little bit of sort of muddiness about exactly what we're dealing with might be a little bit, might be a barrier for us a little bit, maybe. But I do see what you mean. But I just sort of, from our point of view, it's like, because I suppose we're trying to work out what can be done or what we should be recommending should be done London-wide. But I mean, you know, we can only go on what you have. But I think that's the complication, because if lots of women, obviously we know lots of women then are recalled, and we take that out, work out the number how are we getting those numbers down over a period of time, I suppose. It's, I mean, maybe it's us just not being in the sector, not quite understanding this, you know, this specifics of it. But
could I just add, I well recall among this body and many others hearing the comment that ministers should speak to each other in different departments. I recall thinking that actually MOPAC and the Assembly should talk to each other. I think the Deputy Mayor Housing, Deputy Mayor Police and Crime should talk to each other. This applies right across. It also applies to voluntary organisations and statutory services as well. But nonetheless, we can start with the basic numbers we know, so that, for example, if we provide, and we acknowledge a responsibility to provide for about 50 women per month in London, and try to resist being confused by these other awful irritations, then we'll be moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And hopefully, if those interventions are successful, then those numbers would go down, because you would have less people, less women going round the cycle of in and out and everything like that. Okay. Thanks. Going back to CAS 2 and CAS 3. So thanks for that clarity. Could I ask Rachel, what's your experience with the impact of introduction of CAS 2 and CAS 3 on women leaving prison?
Yeah, so I don't think we've supported many women that have been in CAS 2. In CAS 3, it's a bit mixed. I know if probation were here, they would say it's underutilised, that there are kind of spaces for women that aren't being used. They did a bit of a review, and some of that was looking at where the properties were, how close were they to the women's centres. They were finding, this is anecdotal, this isn't a report, but just the feedback they gave me was that if women got to the CAS 3 properties, they tended to stay, but there was this gap of coming out and reaching those properties. And you know, we provide through the gate support, so it's sort of, you know, a sort of discussion about what more support we could provide. But I think I think it's just quite limited. So I think, because I know we've talked a lot about remands and recalls, but they don't have access to CAS 3. No recourse to public funds. Women don't have access to CAS 3. And what after the 84 days? Yeah. So I think as a stopgap, then of course it is welcome to have an option. But I think we've seen a real mixture from local authorities around how it's viewed. So there was one local authority that they felt their kind of duty and responsibilities were done because the woman had come out and she'd had this 84 days of temporary accommodation. Yeah, so it's kind of, and of course that's not, again, it's this inconsistency across the boroughs and how they respond. So it is a bit of a mixed bag, I think, our experience of the outcomes for CAS 3.
Is there any comparison there, again, between... I think it's interesting that if women get to CAS 3, then they're likely to stay. But I suppose the question is, what are the barriers that mean they don't get there? Are the ones who are less likely to stay are just like, well, I'm not going to go there, so because I'm not going to stay, and sort of opting themselves out? What the outcomes are after the 84 days to compare to women who have ended up just homeless, or then women who actually have more stable accommodation to go to. So I suppose, I mean, I think we can assume it's a continuum that, you know, the outcomes would be better along, but I'm just wondering if there's any, if you're aware of any statistics about that, about where CAS 3 sits in terms of helping women getting to where they... putting their life back together, basically.
Yeah, I haven't seen any statistics in relation to CAS 3. I mean, we record outcomes for 3 months post-release. Yeah. So in the last financial year, so 23 to 24, we had 89% of women that were in accommodation after 3 months post-release. Yeah. So that's, kind of support that we've provided. But no, I haven't seen any data around CAS 3. I think one of the barriers would be location and where it is, and the needs. I mean, we've... a lot of the women that we come out, just if they're not suitable for that because they needed supported accommodation, then they'll go a different route. So it's just, it's about who's got access to it, whether it's appropriate. But I think location perhaps is a big issue as well. Yeah,
thanks. That's helpful. I think I suppose nervousness for me is that it feels just like it's a place to put women for a while, rather than something that is actively acknowledging their needs or getting them towards, putting their lives back together. But and it's that timeliness again, I think, isn't it? So it's sort of the and we'll have some challenges around engaging with housing teams around, so it's not coming down, like when it comes down to the day of release, or it comes down to the end of those 84 days, and it's what's that kind of planning that happens in the meantime. Yeah, thank you. Sam, did you have something were you indicating? Yeah.
I was just going to say, in terms of the continuity of the CAS 3 service, the first iteration of those contracts were kind of relatively generic, but as we look towards the next generation, one of the most important parts will be to develop distinct segmentation of the service. So you have distinct CAS 3 provision for women, for older people in prison, because they're the fastest growing cohort in prison, but also that you build in move-on considerations into those contracts, because there are move-on panels that do that work, but there needs to be more of a focus on move-on, because you said it, CAS 3, it plugs a gap. Yeah. But at that 12-week, you are faced with the problem that there isn't enough affordable accommodation, and you are very far down the list if you are someone that's come out of prison.
Yeah. And just following on to that, what support is provided to women? It sounds like there's not necessarily very much in CAS 3 provided to women to support to find long-term accommodation when they're leaving, either in CAS 2 or CAS 3. I'm not sure if anyone... Yes, sorry.
Yeah, that will be down to the community, the CRS service, so either women in prison or advance. So that's our responsibility to then, support, what the different options are.
Fantastic. Thank you. Back to you, Jen.
Thank you. I was surprised to learn that older people are the largest growing cohort in prison. That was very... But yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So next we move on to Assembly Member Tyrrell, please.
Oh, thank you, Chair. If I could direct this question to Sam, John and then Rachel. and that is, what kind of supported accommodation do local councils in London provide to women leaving prisons?
I couldn't give you exact examples of the supported accommodation that exists, but what I can talk to you about is some of the issues in terms of how that support was commissioned. A lot of the time we hear from voluntary organisations that hold these contracts that housing support related contracts are too short, and the problem you have with that is that you can't provide the long-lasting sustainable support that someone needs alongside that housing to ensure that they can recover and reintegrate successfully back into society. So that's a particular challenge, but I wouldn't be able to give you kind of specific examples of supported accommodation.
Sorry, I can't add much to that, but just to say, inadequate support, but nonetheless, it is not always very long-term support that we're looking for, because if we provide the safe homes on release as the base for resettlement, incidentally, the only base for resettlement, because however good your 84 days are, that is not any kind of base for resettlement, then you can begin to put together mental health services, resumption of care and custody of children, the possibility even of employment services. All that can begin to come together in safe homes, and that is really, in a sense, providing there is the support initially, that is more important than anything else as the base for all the other bits of the jigsaw. So I think that needs to be borne in mind in looking at support needs and accommodation needs as part of the package.
Yeah, it varies borough to borough. So borough like Lambeth has a supported accommodation pathway. So there's sort of steps, there's like an assessment process and then into supported accommodation. So that usually is where you've got staff 24/7, a key worker that's then supporting around your needs and looking at what those longer term options are. I think people can end up staying in supported accommodation for quite a long time. I think sometimes, again, the move on from there is limited. I think the pathways can be quite complex. So Lambeth is an example again. So they have a mental health pathway that's different to the supported accommodation pathway, so that will be funded differently, different kind of referral access routes in. They are looking to review and do a new women's pathway, which will be interesting. I know they've done sort of consultation with people who've lived experience as part of that, which is good. Again, I think Camden's got kind of quite a good pathway, so I think it varies. There is a gap around knowing exactly what there is for women, so we're ourselves in Advance and Probation are working on trying to develop a women's directory, because of then, you know, where we're sort of struggling to get accommodation, is there direct access that we could like tap into? And there doesn't seem to be that in existence, and it would really help, I think, to have some kind of mapping of what there is, because I think some of the stuff that exists, it mixes men's and women's, so I don't think there's anything that just pulls out, unless Homeless Link or something have it, but I don't think there's something that exists that just shows what the women's kind of options are. So again, I think some of the funding arrangements and some of the pathway arrangements to get access to things can be quite complex to navigate, and it's a mixed picture across London. And I guess Lambeth have recently done a strategic needs assessment, and I guess each borough will be doing that and then working out from their population kind of what they need to have. But again, it seems sort of, I guess some of it's access to funding or how they use funding will vary, and again how they're kind of prioritising what they need.
Could I just mention, funding, of course, is important, and I'm glad that's come up in that way, and it relates to the provision of support. But another interesting point is that if you have collaboration between London councils and G15, particularly, but also with other pansexual agencies working under that, you then have an agency which can begin to combine examination of funding and begin to say, look, we across Greater London need this for all the London boroughs or whatever else. The amalgamation of all those support needs and housing needs, whatever else, is combined in this. And you then have a much more authoritative bid for that than you have from bits of 32 boroughs and bits of other agencies and so on. So I think that's the way it should be addressed. I'm not trying to put all the London boroughs into one bag. Of course, they all have different needs and circumstances, but that is the central way of dealing with this problem.
Thank you. Assemblymember Garbutt, did you still want to come in? Before you do, I just wanted to welcome Christchurch Primary School from Redbridge. Nice to see you all. Hello. Welcome to the Housing Committee. Okay, Assemblymember Garbutt.
Thank you. Oh, a lot of this is really reminding me of when I was an NHS commissioner and all the money being in the wrong place in multiple services and then managing wait lists and then all having a common cause like the housing crisis. So I'm feeling quite like I'm back working in the NHS. My question is a bit slightly random, but I spoke to a woman who's a trustee in a centre in Hull who supports women who are survivors of domestic abuse. And the centre acquired homes through social investment bonds and are providing accommodation for women through that route. And I just wondered if that's a model you've heard of anyone talking about for providing housing for women leaving prisons. There's like £10 billion in social investment in 2023, and I just wondered if it's something that you know of. I'm going to put it to the second panel as well. I just wondered if, because it's the same, you know, it will really, you could really demonstrate the impact, and I'm sure that a social investor would be interested in investing in homes for women leaving prison. You're all kind of shaking your head, so I'm assuming that no one's really heard. Yeah, Rachel.
Oh, it's flashing green. I don't know if I've... Oh, no. So I think Housing for Women may do that, so it might be worth reaching out for them. They've also got a supported housing project in Lewisham, which they presented on last week, where they hadn't had any recalls from anyone they were supporting in a year, which has sounded brilliant. So they may well have. I think that's a really interesting point, because I think sort of models like the Housing First model, women that we've supported that have experienced that speak really highly of it. So the having the security of a permanent tenancy and that wraparound support. And Housing First models are often for where people have been kind of multiply excluded or haven't kind of managed in those sort of supported accommodations. So I think having those variety of options is needed. And I think you're right. I think looking at those kind of models, and I think there are kind of funders out there that support that, like Commonweal and people that can kind of source some of that housing. But yeah, Housing for Women may well do something like that. I don't know.
Great, that's really helpful. John, did you want to come in?
If I may, yes, I think the example you've given is unique, but interestingly, there are a number of other unique ones dotted around the country. Each of them is, you know, exciting, interesting, and should be studied. And I think it's one of the jobs that you might ask Tom Copley and, sorry, I can't remember her name, the new DM for Police and Crime, to look into and come back and report to you on what those models are and which ones might be suitable for use in Greater London. The other thing is that Councillor Grace Williams, who's Deputy Chair of London Councils and also leading executive responsibility on housing, has just recently been welcoming the recent budget announcement. I'm sure you all read key issues. Well, I mean, those kind of things show that they are ready to talk about issues like this. They're ready to collaborate. So when they get the letter from the Mayor that I hope you will prompt, they will not be surprised. They'll say, yeah, we're on board.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I've got, it might be the final question to all of you, starting with John. So the Mayor co-commissions Pan-London programmes that provide accommodation to women leaving prison and also invests in wraparound women's centre services. And these provide housing for women exiting prison on licence and women who've self-referred. So do you think that these programmes go far enough to addressing the housing needs of women leaving prison? And I would also appreciate any reflections you may have about the nature and the scale of the wraparound women's centre services that are provided. If you have an opinion on that, you don't have to.
Yes, of course. First of all, any kind of wraparound provision is to be welcomed. Any improvement in the provisions that we've all been talking about is to be welcomed, but they still add up to pretty muddy water, and that's one of the things we've got to address. And I suppose what I'm relying on as being one of the outcomes from today's meeting is the call for the Mayor to act in the leadership of coordinated collaborative work on this whole thing. And I think that could not only bring together these diverse models, but also see what is the best and what are the most appropriate ones for London-wide development. So, I mean, that will be a real thing. So, the Mayor can be legitimately quite proud of the first two sections of that motion, but at the moment they are an impressive political statement. They mean damn all until they're actually delivered in your constituencies. Thank you.
Should we start? Did you want to come in?
I was just going to say, in the reports that we wrote on accommodation, we actually highlighted some women's centres across the country. And one of the really interesting ideas that came across was the potential to fund specialist women's centres to develop their own accommodation offer, so that you had, A, that kind of single point of contact to help you navigate the system, but B, the wraparound support with the accommodation all in that same piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funding we get for the wraparound service is vital. So we run similar services in Surrey and in Manchester, and it's not the same. So we don't have as much flexibility as we have in London, being able to work with women at different points. So it's absolutely vital, and I think that we deliver a good service, and trying to sort of look at the kind of diversion and those earlier points as well is something that we can do here in a different way than we are able to do in other areas. I think we've sort of highlighted the gaps. There is a lack of accommodation options for women. So I think it'd be really interesting to map out exactly what that funding has provided in terms of housing for women coming out of prison, and where those gaps are. And I guess that's part of what you're trying to do. And I've forgotten my last point. But yeah.
It may come back to you, because I have one final question before we wrap up. Is there anything that you'd like to mention, that you'd like to see from the Mayor? I was particularly struck by the point really being made about loss of tenancy because of women being on remand. I mean, you don't lose your tenancy if you go into hospital for 3 months and so is that something which in my mind is simple, but clearly is not, otherwise it would have happened. But is there something that you would want to see from the Mayor by way of leadership, or by way of just kind of direct suggestion to boroughs and other stakeholders, and also in the police and criminal justice, that you think would really help women leaving prison?
Yeah, I agree. So you can get housing benefit paid towards your tenancy for up to 3 months, but it's post 3 months that you then lose your accommodation if you have accommodation when you go into prison. So something around the flexibility. I think trying to address, look at housing from that point of if that's a contributor to women going into prison. So whether that's remand or recall, I think would address a lot of the issues that we're talking about. I think trying to look at a kind of a cross-borough. I think it's partly about the delivery of the briefing and the protocol, but having a responsibility cross-borough around that, so that could take some of that good practice in some of the boroughs like Lambeth and look at what would that look like across borough. I think would make a real difference.
There are a number of things that would fall beyond the remit of the Mayor, but getting his support for them would be brilliant. I know he received quite a lot of flack when he recently spoke about ex-offenders getting priority for housing. It is obviously a huge issue, and work needs to be done across London, working with local authorities to ensure that there is that objective interpretation of priority needs, so that people that need it can get it. There are other things tinkering around the edges that could help people. Lots of women leaving prison are in financial distress. There are reforms to universal credit that could really help. We're really pleased to see that they've reduced the deductions cap, which was 25% down to 15%. But there are certain things that could be done. For example, have a deductions holiday for people coming out of prison, so that they have access to more money, which can go towards things such as rent deposits. So I guess getting mayoral support for lots of little tinkering around the edge of policies would be really helpful.
Natasha, did you want to add anything?
No, not from me, thank you.
Okay, and then final word to John in that case.
Okay, thank you. The fact is that within prisons, they often do their best about the tendencies of women, the tendencies that women might have when they're incarcerated. But a number of things. Firstly, many of these women live in chaotic circumstances and the tenancy might not have been in their name. Secondly, if they get letters from the landlord while they're in prison, unless they consult somebody about that, the possibility is that it'll just pile up with a lot of other correspondence. So the kind of thing that we need is solicitors who are prepared to devote pro bono time to work in prisons, to take on cases like that, to advise women what can you do in respect of your tenancy, or at least shared accommodation that you might have outside while you're in custody. So supporting prisons in that is important. The other thing that's relevant to this is that so that these things don't come as so much of a surprise to us, the more that the Mayor and you can do to promote interest in the subject through your regular newsletters and other things, the better. Because the only way we're going to get reforms to the whole of the criminal justice system, including prisons, is, of course, to have wider public interest and discussion into it. Why does it fail? What should we do about those failures? What can we do about this and that? So the more we get that discussion going into wider circles, the more we have on the edge of realistic reforms.
Thank you for that from all of you, and thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been really, really educational. And John, if you could please pass on our regards to Mr. French, from Bronzefield, who was missed today. He's always welcome to come back to speak to us, but to thank him again for taking us around the prison a few weeks ago. And so now we're going to adjourn for about 10 minutes to change panels. Welcome back to London Assembly's Housing Committee, and welcome to our second panel of guests on housing for women leaving prison. We have Tom Copley, who's the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Residential Development, Velvet Dibley, who's a Senior Housing Policy Officer at the GLA, and Will Balakrishnan, who's the Director of Commissioning and Partnerships at the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, MOPAC. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Assembly Member Boff.
Thank you. Mr Copley, how many housing programmes and services commissioned by the Mayor provide support for women leaving prison?
Thank you, Assembly Member Boff. Good morning, committee. The first thing I'd like to say is that I really welcome this investigation by the committee into this topic, and it was very eye-opening to join you and MOPAC and the London Prisons Mission at Bronzefield Prison for the visit the other week. I learned an awful lot, and I'm very grateful to John Plummer in particular for arranging that and the passion and tenacity with which he campaigns on this issue. Turning to your question, Assembly Member Boff, we have a number of programmes where women who have had contact with the criminal justice system are likely to be accommodated. It's worth noting that none of the programmes have direct referrals from prisons or HM Prison and Probation. Referrals will come via local authorities. But there are a number of programmes where women who have had contact with the criminal justice system are likely to be accommodated. So first of all, the Domestic Abuse Safe Accommodation Programme. This brings together capital and revenue funding to increase provision of safe accommodation for victims and survivors of domestic abuse. The single homeless accommodation programme. This is for rough sleepers and young people who are at risk of rough sleeping and homelessness, and we've commissioned a number of projects through this, including Housing First projects. The Care and Support Specialised Housing programme. This tends to be this is for older Londoners and Londoners with disabilities or mental health needs. The Rough Sleeping Accommodation programme, which, as the name suggests, is for rough sleepers. And finally, the Move On programme, which is for rough sleepers and victims and survivors of domestic abuse.
Of those programmes, none of them are specifically for women leaving prison, as far as I can see from their titles, but they are for people. Many prisoners will have experienced those, will have those experiences, and therefore be qualify for receiving some support, but nothing targeted specifically at women leaving prison.
That's correct, Assembly Member Boff.
Thank
yes.
You. And what is the impact of this support on women leaving prison and their families, do you think?
The impact of the programmes?
Yes.
Yes, well, I think they will all have a very positive impact. I mean, it was striking from the visit, and particularly talking to the women that we spoke to, the number, and looking at the figures, the number who do leave prison and are ending up homeless, the lengths to which they will go to avoid rough sleeping, so essentially going and becoming hidden homelessness, but still probably being in quite dangerous and very precarious situations. And, you know, the striking fact, which is the extent to which they will deliberately miss a probation appointment in order to come back into prison because it is safer for them in prison than outside. So I would say that the programmes that we do fund and we do commission will have a significantly positive impact where women are referred into them by local authorities.
Does the Mayor monitor those outcomes?
So we don't have data relating to women who move into this accommodation who have had a history of contact with the criminal justice system. If they are rough sleepers who have been identified by an outreach team and they are on the chain database and their last place of residence will be noted, and you know that might well be prison. But as we know, and going back to what I was saying earlier, a lot of women won't rough sleep or will go to great lengths to hide themselves and therefore won't necessarily be recorded on the chain database. While we will have data on the women who are specifically rough sleeping, more broadly, we wouldn't necessarily have data if they are homeless in another way, i.e. hidden homeless.
So do you specifically record in those outcomes, do you specifically record whether or not somebody has left prison?
If they're on the chain database and they are identified by an outreach team and their last residence was prison, that will be recorded. The chain data would indicate, we've got the chain data in 2021, of both male and female, 2.16, that's 121 of new rough sleepers listed prison as their last settled base. The 2023 Women's Rough Sleeping Census, which is national, found that nationally 21 respondents, that's 2.6% of the women identified through that census, had exited prison into street homelessness.
Right. You've allocated, or rather the Mayor has allocated about 60 million to the single homeless accommodation programme for 24-25.
Yes.
The Mayor has previously stated this funding is to provide housing-led services for women leaving prison. How much of this programme's funding has been allocated to services that provide housing support for women leaving prison?
So to be clear, the SHAP programme is not specifically for women leaving prison. It's much more broad than that. It is quite possible that some of the schemes that we have funded will accommodate women who are leaving prison, but we don't, as far as I know, have data on that, unless Velvet tells me otherwise.
No, so we don't collect data on the number of people that have left prison that are accommodated on our programmes. So for SHAP, as Tom has said, for SHAP you would be accommodated if you were a rough sleeper, but as we know, there are very few women that present in our rough sleeping data due to the risk that rough sleeping presents for women.
In previous panel, we received evidence, most clearly it was stated that there is a lack of London-wide leadership on this issue, sort of patchy, in some cases poor services from London boroughs, with some notable exceptions. Mm-hmm. Should there be a dedicated, consistent London-wide housing pathway for women leaving prison?
I mean, I think this is something that we will be exploring, or are exploring, I should say, as part of our work on the rough sleeping plan of action, and more broadly in the engagement that we do with London councils and the government on homelessness more broadly. I think it's quite clear at the moment that the system isn't working because of just the perverse things that we heard in prison about how, for example, the system is clearly encouraging women to miss their probation appointments so they can go back in because they are ending up homeless. So clearly there is something that is not working at the moment. You mentioned there are some boroughs that do this well, and I think Lambeth is one of the key ones that is highlighted, and I certainly think that boroughs around London should be learning from the Lambeth experience as to how they are doing things.
Yes. Should the Mayor be taking the lead in trying to coordinate this?
I think that the Mayor and the GLA has a leadership role. I think we have to be clear where roles and responsibilities sit, however, and the key players here are the boroughs who have the statutory responsibility. That's not me trying to shy away.
I know. We all know that the boroughs have that responsibility, and that it's not a responsibility of the Mayor, and that's very clear. And I don't want to pretend in anything else. But what should the Mayor be doing, therefore, to show leadership on this?
Well, I think, first of all, we should be as we are, taking it as a very serious and important part of the work we are doing on the plan of action. And this is why I think this investigation comes at actually such an opportune moment. We've got the work going on the plan of action. London councils are leading a piece of work on homelessness and temporary accommodation more broadly, and the government has launched its interministerial conference on homelessness. So you've got three very pertinent pieces of work to this discussion going on. So I think that's where the Mayor is best placed to provide leadership. I'm sure that we'll discuss some of the later, and I think there are some questions later on what MOPAC is doing, and there's another stream of work that's going on through MOPAC. But I think, our convening role around the plan of action and our close working with London councils in partnership is the way to make some progress on this issue.
But how is it possible to identify this particular group if you don't record who's in it?
So I think
I get the point that you're talking about broader programs that may include women leaving prison. That's not really the question. It's what specifically is there in place, or will there be in place, and what leadership the Mayor can provide for women leaving prison. And I don't want to hear about. We've got programs about rough sleeping. We've got programs about domestic violence. All of those good. What specifically is there for women leaving prison?
But I think the key thing here is getting the process right so that women are able to access, women leaving prison are able to access these schemes funded through these programs. And that's making sure that what's happening at the local authority referral level is absolutely crucial, because it's councils that are, in general, referring people into these services, and that's why I think we've got to get that bit right. And local councils, as we know, are under an enormous amount of pressure at the moment. Really, after decades of their funding, more than decades, of their funding being cut, so they are in a very, very difficult position. But where this work between us and London councils is really important is trying to find a solution to that. And getting this system to work better so that women are able to access the accommodation that we are funding, dependent on which kind of accommodation is appropriate to their specific needs.
But don't you think, and can I just, this is the last question, do you mind?
No, sorry, I don't mind at all. I was actually just going to ask you if you would care to extend your question to Will, because it might be a MOPAC issue.
Oh, right, yes. Well, it isn't, but if you wish to answer, you please do. I don't want to stop anyone.
Yeah. I can do my best, Assembly Member. Sorry, so what absolutely specifically would you like me to respond to?
Well, I didn't. It was the chair who wanted you to.
Maybe we'll talk about it later.
You certainly will come in. It's just, perhaps to Assembly, to Mr. Copley, if we have that intent, if the Mayor is going to want to take leadership, do you think it's now time for the Mayor to appoint a dedicated liaison officer or team to ensure that there's a more consistent approach across London, working with the boroughs, the G15 and other partners as well?
So I think we already have officers within the team who are working on this issue. In fact, we've got one of those officers here with us today, Velvet, who's been doing fantastic work on this. So it's something that is being taken up as part of the work we're doing on the plan of action, and we've got a whole group of people across both our rough sleeping and our housing policy team who are working on that. So I think we are already dedicating a good amount of resource from within the GLA into trying to make the situation better.
So, good point. So, Ms. Dibley, when was the last time you convened a meeting of the boroughs and or the G15 to talk about specifically women leaving prison?
So last Thursday I was at the Housing Knowledge event that was convened by MOPAC. So at that event we were discussing how the women's best practice briefing has been kind of disseminated, and progress on that. And we also had representations from Camden and Lambeth who were discussing the kind of particular issues that they face in working with the Prisons and Probation Service, working with prisons and allocating homes to women leaving prison, who are quite a small number of a very incredibly large number of homeless families that they have a duty to support.
And who was at that meeting?
So in terms of specific boroughs?
Yeah.
Camden and Lambeth.
The ones that we know are performing quite well in this area.
They were presenting, Assembly Member, but there's wide ranging. So I think, I mean, maybe why Assembly Member wanted me to come in is just the locus of this work is through our work that we lead across City Hall through the criminal justice system, and MOPAC is the place where that happens. You know, the sort of key interface here. I absolutely appreciate the homelessness angle, but the people who really know what prison leavers are becoming homeless are probation. You know, and the people who are charged most strongly with sort of forging that is the work that we do through the criminal justice system. So I might argue there is already a pathway for homelessness. There is already an accommodation pathway. It's the probation pathway. You know, you heard from the CAS 3 providers earlier, etc. So I wonder if that's why the Assembly Member, the Chair wanted me to come in, just because I think the locus of this work tends to be, and that's probably why I'm here as the sort of senior bureaucrat in the room, as it were, is it tends to be our convening work that we do around the women's blueprint. And I think, you know, you heard a bit earlier and you heard from others. I mean, maybe I'll go through it later if you're interested, but I'm incredibly proud of the work that has been achieved through that blueprint. I think it's brilliant. You know, I think you've heard so much about the constraints, you know, both when we were walking around Bronzefield last week and also earlier from the panel here. But that's not to say we haven't made progress. We've made tremendous progress. It's brilliant.
I'm aware that I don't. One thing we shouldn't do as Assembly members is trample on another person's questions. So I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the London Blueprint. But what I am saying is that I appreciate that meetings have taken place, rather self-selecting meetings have taken place, of the people who've got something to brag about when they go to these meetings. More interested in who isn't at the meeting and how do you get them in there, and wonder whether or not that's a role that the Mayor should be taking on, or Miss Dibley should be taking on.
Just to expand slightly, and I appreciate what you're saying around Camden and Lambeth, and I think there is a really key role for us to play in sharing that. Everyone around the table was very keen to understand exactly how Lambeth were doing it, and I think that we did, MOPAC and the GLA did take an action to kind of disseminate that further so that that was understood where it could be kind of applicable to other boroughs. I think in terms of, within my own role, I've always got my kind of ears to the ground. I'm kind of sit on the Pan London Housing Needs and Homelessness Group, which is convened by London councils and has representation from across the 32. So I've been working closely with probation to oversee, well not oversee, but to keep an eye on essentially the early release protocol. So we do have interactions with boroughs as they kind of manage and respond to release from prison. It's just in that particular event we were focusing on best practice. So I hope that kind of contextualises that a bit further.
Okay, I think it's time for somebody else to ask a question, really. But I can't promise that I won't come back. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I was just to clarify, I was just intrigued because Assembly Member Boff was asking Tom about numbers and so on, and I figured, as the MOPAC person here, of all the people that's likely to have a number, it feels like no one's really counting the women in or out, so to speak. And so I was trying to, I think, inelegantly say, perhaps MOPAC could count the women in and out so that simplistically Tom's people could know what kind or how much housing or housing support is required in the capital, I think was my point, because I think we will hopefully get to clarify that by the end of this scrutiny, but that would be really welcome if that is something, if you can't provide it now, to then provide some clarity in writing to us.
I mean, probation, you know, HMPPS have the numbers. It's one of those sort of strange things about prisons, isn't it, that people in London prisons aren't necessarily Londoners, and Londoners aren't necessarily in London prisons. So it is not something MOPAC has the data in for, but it is data that is available and can get.
Yeah. So, but then just really quickly.
I was just going to say, I mean, from Bronzefield, we had the figure 50 women a month from Bronzefield.
No, we do have that, but I just think it would be really helpful, kind of as an ongoing basis, to have that data disaggregated. It would be helpful just to have a version of the truth that we can all work from, because it's slightly different from place to place. But that, I think, was the point I was trying to make. Thank you. Assembly Member Turrell.
Thank you, Chair. Will be pleased to know that this question is, how has the London Blueprint strategy been implemented, and how has it progressed and been monitored?
Oh, not much. No, sorry. So I gave the game away. No, I mean, look, genuinely, I think it's great that we're, and I said this. I said this when I came to Bronzefield with you. I think it's great that we're taking such a big interest in this. Sometimes I feel a bit of an outcast in my sort of CJS corner as the sort of lead convener for the criminal justice system in London. So it's lovely to come to the Housing Committee. Also, you're always very friendly here, so thank you for the invite. I'm really. It's true. I mean, come on, Police and Crime Committee is can get a little spicy. Not to me, thankfully. You're always very nice to me, colleagues that sit on both. But I'm quite proud of the blueprint and what it's done. I mean, my colleagues do a lot of the heavy lifting on it, and really, I mean, it's been around since 2018, which is some time now. The partnership is really strong, and to your point, actually, Assembly Member Boff, I always think, like, one of my key KPIs for meetings is, do people turn up, and when they turn up, are they motivated? Do they contribute? Or do they participate? And we've seen since 2018 this meeting and this blueprint and what we convene in this space just go from strength to strength. There's so much interest in it. I'll be honest. Some of the voluntary sector providers do have some of the biggest voices. You met a couple of those at Bronzefield, didn't you? Advance and Women in Prison, who we think are terrific. We co-commission them. Massive advocates in this area. But that's not to say the statutory partners don't come, they do. None of us really like getting told what to do, but it's quite hard when you're hearing that level of insight from people who are working with women on the face-to-face all the time, isn't it? But it was a big it was a massive work to get to the first blueprint, as I say, which was then published in 2029 with a thematic action plan. And the Blueprint Delivery Group owns this work. And they've actually just come to the end of one set of this action plan. We're now on to the second set, which has been agreed and will be published shortly. Some really great things about it before I tell you what it's delivered. There's a really robust equality impact assessment. This is so important in CJS work. We know it's a place where disproportionality is baked in. We know it's a place where lots of women become forgotten. So I'm really proud of that. Second thing is, it is independently evaluated. And again, just with the next iteration of the action plan, the Blueprint Group are also publishing part of that impact evaluation. It's really good, and I think it's a kind of, this is a space where we haven't made much progress. That's why we've had a motion on it, right, in the past. So to have that sort of concrete evidence that something's happened, I think is so powerful. I mean, here are some of the highlights for me. I unashamedly like services, and I unashamedly like co-commissioned services, because I think where the mayor can come into a space and get alongside statutory partners and help them innovate, help them expand, help them do things differently, I think that's where we're brilliant. We're really the only agency who's placed to do that, and it's the work that most excites me. That's why I love that co-commissioned service that we have in women's rehabilitation. So the MOPAT bit is actually the bit for women who aren't yet in the criminal justice system, which is really exciting. But that's been a huge investment. If my probation colleagues were here with me today, they'd also be lauding that. And I mean, to go, it's not my job to make policy, but, you can see the direction of travel there. If potentially less women were having short custodial sentences, which I don't think you have to be Nostradamus to think might be a direction of travel here, then those sort of community co-commissioned services are exactly where we're going to do that supervision in the community. So in London, we've actually already got something, which is quite exciting. Supported housing for women, we've been working with them on the MOJ funding. I think the Deputy Mayor alluded to that earlier. That's really exciting. You had our CAS 3 provider earlier from probation to deliver community accommodation services. We, through the Blueprint, through MOPAT, through the Mayor, lobbied really hard to make sure that there was women-specific accommodation within CAS 3. So, CAS 3 guarantees 84 days. Without our lobbying and intervention, that wouldn't have been women-specific, and we know how we know how that'd be. And that's partially because, the other part of my life is obviously I'm really proud to be the responsible director for tackling violence against women and girls at City Hall. And it's also through, again, a bit of joint work on the domestic abuse safe accommodation programme, which we've talked about in other committees. Something I'm massively excited about is, we've got an avenue there because we know there's a big intersection, don't we, between victim and offender. So we know that many of the women are actually victims of exploitation, but also of domestic abuse. So there are pathways in through that support programme too, which are really exciting. And just little things as well, like, Holloway Women's Prison. When I was a student, I used to live next to Holloway Women's Prison, so I always think of it quite fondly, oddly. But we made sure through City Hall lobbying that a proportion of the housing that Islington, are overseeing there through Peabody, is for women in the criminal justice system. So, I think there's just sort of some of the things, Velvet's talked about the practice briefing the other day, but, that's the women in prison, the women leaving prison practice briefing. That was what that knowledge event was about. A brilliant bit of work that we've done with G15, with boroughs, with practitioners, with everybody. I think this is classic mayoral stuff, actually, is where can we use our levers, where can we use our convening to get the people round the table, energise them, but direct them towards a bit of shared work that's really going to make a difference. So I'm incredibly proud. And we're going again. We've got a whole nother action plan to go. So sorry if I'm effusive about it. I think it's great, Carl. I really do.
Yep, nothing further from me, so back to the chair. So that was very...
Can I take Assembly Member Garbutt and then Assembly Member Boff?
Thanks for that, Will. I'm just really interested in what you were saying about the Equalities Impact Assessment, and it would be just good to hear what that identified and how that influenced the work since 2019 and what you've specifically seen as an impact. Is it just women in general, or is it kind of more specific than that?
Great question, because we know, don't we, that people don't lead single-issue lives, and I started to get into that a little bit with that victim-offender overlap dynamics. But there's also we know from our work in the CJS with member, particularly also when it's a smaller cohort, we can get more in, is the intersectionality. So let me give you an example. My colleagues actually on a visit tomorrow. We really proud of the way we work with the women, what they call the women's sector. I don't love the term, but sort of particularly the Buy and For organisations in that. It's a real strength of MOPAC. We've got one active in this space called Hibiscus, and I think it's just a really good example of something we identified, particularly around an intersection within some minoritized groups and migrant women in contact with the criminal justice system. It's called Tackling Double Disadvantage Partnership. Isn't that just kind of beautifully framed? So that's straight out of that needs assessment and straight out of the Blueprint Delivery Group, identifying that intersection, and then MOPAC able to find somebody called Hibiscus to do something about it. So just a little example of how it works.
That's really great. So can you, that's a really good example, and it's great that you're working well with the Buy and For sector, but can you point to anything that's actually made a specific difference since 2019? Because obviously it's been in place for 5 years. So just specifically on the EQIA, have you done another one to kind of see if we're still in the same position, or is it an EQIA from 2019?
No, it gets refreshed. So it was refreshed during the first blueprint, and it's now been refreshed as part of the next action plan. So it'll be published alongside that. I'd love to tell you that needs have changed dramatically. And unfortunately, I don't think they really have. But I think what we get better at increasingly, at MOPAC, but actually I'm really proud, I think, as a public sector, is we're getting way better at identifying the intersectionalities now. We're getting way better at understanding more nuance. And this sort of frame about, people don't lead single-issue lives, I think is just becoming more and more based. So we're not just, we sort of stop looking at things through just a CJS lens, even though these are women in the criminal justice system. And the more we can, and I think that might be some of the answer, by the way, to thinking about, how we work differently with boroughs on this. There was a comment earlier about tenancy sustainment, wasn't there? Many years ago, I worked with Shelter, and we used to sort of come at things, with whatever would make best sense at the time. So it's sort of, the point was made you wouldn't lose your tenancy if you were in hospital for a period, but you would with remote. There's something about in these practice briefs, in this work, the more we see the intersection, the less we are sort of it's criminal justice, therefore the tenancy ends. So that's kind of how we're steering the group. But ultimately, we are in our levers pulling rather than getting out there kind of space here. And it's for us to kind of try and bring those partners into that space rather than tell them what to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Assembly Member Boff.
He's back.
Just to say, I get about bringing people into that space. Are they coming in?
I'd love to tell you that this is top of everyone's shopping list. I think that's just. I think we all know that's not the reality. It doesn't mean we're giving up. I think it's the top of every practitioner who works in this space's shopping list. But if you mean is all of the the G15 send representatives to lots of things. Am I suggesting that this blueprint has enthused all of them immediately? All the time? Well, I think we've got to be honest, probably not. There are competing pressures for all these organisations. That doesn't mean we're not trying, though. Is that what you meant? Sorry if I'm not giving the best evidence.
Well, it would be a good idea if you tried harder, because the real problem, as we've had outlined earlier, was that this very patchy provision in the London boroughs. And we can have good blueprints, which are very good, very good inputs, but unless the outputs are fundamentally changing, then what is it all worth? And the only way we can change the outputs, is through the attendance of boroughs and the G15 at some of these meetings, focused on these issues alone, not the wider issues that those groups will be involved with day to day.
I think it's a really fair point, isn't it? And as I understand it, every borough is setting their. Every borough has some flexibility around how they choose to allocate the stock and the housing that they have. Those are really tricky decisions. It's been a long time since I was on borough, but I remember, this is probably very out of date, but when I was in Lambeth some time ago, I remember this conversation, and it was a political decision. Ultimately, there was officer advice, but it was a political decision about that allocation. So for me, I suppose there's stuff I can do as an officer, and there's stuff I can do to highlight need, to highlight intersection, to kind of explain why I think this is important, provide an evidence base, provide a theory of change. That's the stuff I do. And I try and give that to people enhanced with stories, because I think stories change the world. So there's always, we're always collecting case studies. We're trying to show the women that you met at Bronzefield. We're trying to show their stories all the time. But ultimately, I can't do the political.
Yeah, which is originally why I addressed it to the Deputy Mayor. I mean, the biggest lie in politics is if you build it, they will come. You've got a great blueprint, but nobody's actually turning up, aren't they?
Well, I think that's a bit mean.
Lambeth and Camden are turning up.
So Lambeth and Camden presented at the practice briefing as examples of good practice. That doesn't mean there weren't other boroughs in the room listening. They just weren't the presenters, were they? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say exactly the whole point of a best practice meeting is the boroughs that are doing it well present to the others with the expectation that the others are there to listen, learn, and hopefully to emulate. Which I wasn't at this briefing. I should add I wasn't in the room, but I understand what the kind of objectives of a best practice briefing are.
Sometimes you need a cattle prod in order to get people to come. But, okay,
I don't disagree.
No, I was just about to say, just to confirm, London councils were there as well. So I've been speaking to the lead on our respective lead on the London Council side to make sure that we've taken a joint approach between the GLA and London councils to make sure that there is a representative, even if it's not specifically from an individual borough, but a representative in a pan-London sense. at those meetings. But as Tom and Will have said, it was to disseminate the best practice. It was largely the people that are doing well in this area that were there.
And were they asked to sign up to something?
Not at that meeting, no. So the women's best practice briefing has been disseminated, and at the housing knowledge event, it focused on both the third sector providers and boroughs who were looking at whether or not this had been implemented effectively. So it wasn't necessarily that we were asking anyone to commit to anything in that meeting.
But is that a request that's going to be made at some point in the future?
I think, again, this is something that we need to take forward as part of the work on the plan of action. Boroughs are, as I was saying earlier, under an enormous amount of pressure. What I would encourage boroughs to do is actually to look at whether or not some changes to sort of the what happens upstream could then save some money down the line, so it becomes, an investment that will pay for itself, or perhaps more so.
There's a whole list of items which one could one could mention that if only they'd have a little bit of thought first, they might save money later. But thank you very. Oh, Ms. Dibley.
No, and just to say, work around this has really picked up, and that is largely thanks to John Plummer, who I know that was on the panel this morning. In the past 2 or 3 weeks, I've met with London Prisons and Probation at least 3 times on this issue. And in terms of how this is going to be picked up in the rough sleeping plan of action, both Prisons and Probation and the Home Office, who also play a key role in accommodating women who have no recourse to, who are NRPF, public resources, also were in the room. So we are working even more closely, and this is going to be women leaving institutions will be part of the rough sleeping plan of action, and also the conversations that we're having with government around homelessness in general.
Thank you.
That's fine. I wanted to just following what Assembly Member Boff started off his conversation with you, Will. Obviously, you've done that piece of work around kind of identifying issues and causes. I'm wondering if there is a way to have greater clarity between the commissioning work that you do to inform the decisions as MOPAC and the quote-unquote bricks and mortar work, but also the kind of support element of the housing that is required, the different types of housing that the GLA can and should do, if it were possible to do that for the number of women that we're talking about. And I don't know whether, is there a bricks and mortar conversation which is happening in parallel to what you're doing? And I would appreciate kind of if you've got any thoughts as well, Tom.
Absolutely. I mean, housing colleagues will no doubt have a view on this. Mine is that it's back to this point that people don't lead single-issue lives. I think it's very unlikely that the vast majority of women who become homeless when they're leaving the criminal justice system did not already have needs that would have placed them that would have placed them in a relative. I don't want to use the inelegant language, as I say, it's long since I've been in the housing sector, but there'd already be a high need case in a borough's funding allocation. So for me, the issue isn't sort of necessarily specific provision for women leaving prison, and in fact, in other parts of these committees, we for example, on employment, we're talking about ban the box and things. We're increasingly trying to say, well, this is just being in the criminal justice system is just one form of.
So can I just interrupt? But why is it not specifically around women leaving prison? Because that in itself adds a dimension and complexity that if you weren't in the criminal justice system, you'd still have all of those issues. I think one of the things that I've understood this correctly, is that there is a specific set of circumstances which needs a specific intervention, and it can't just be part of the general response to women who might be facing homelessness. It is different. And it is different if you have just returned from prison, or you're kind of on that journey which might put you there?
So, I mean, I think probation do a really good job with the resources they have at putting support around women who are leaving prison. It is their statutory job, and I think they actually do sort of quite well in London. I suppose the point I was probably inelegantly responding to is, you know, maybe I was sort of second guessing what you might mean here is, you know, should there be specific housing built and ring-fenced in terms of bricks and mortar for women leaving prison? I suppose my just personal needs-based view would be no. You know, I think not. You know, many of the women leaving prison will have complex needs. Those complex needs aren't changed by their going into prison or not. You know, so I would increasingly, I think we encourage people to just see being in the criminal justice system as another tell of need. I can see that's not really buttering your parsnips there, Assembly members.
I don't think it is, because I'll come back to you in a sec. Just that's all very well and good, but ultimately that woman still needs a place to live, and I can't speak for the whole committee on what the view is on whether or not there should be housing specifically for women leaving prison, whether it should be permanent or temporary or whatever. We haven't had that conversation, but it doesn't kind of add up if we're not then assuming that having a place to stay is a key part of keeping them out of the criminal justice system.
Oh, totally. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't have a place to stay. I'm suggesting everyone should have a place to stay. I'm suggesting, I suppose, that is made, you know, that boroughs are having to make those choices based on need. We know if you're leaving the criminal justice system, you get this little offer, don't you? You get CAS 3, so you get 85 nights, you get wraparound from probation, you get, you know, proper supervision plan, you know, anywhere other than Bronzefield, you get a proper departure lounge where, you know, these things are sort of planned out for you. You know, and I think actually reoffending rates are dropping for women. In London, so John's saying no. I thought they were. I thought they've gone down from 35% to 29%.
No, I just want to come in and say I'm not convinced either that having a ring-fenced sort of housing sort of capital programme is the right approach. I think the problem is that you know, women are you know, coming out of prison and then not making it into the range of different kinds of specialist and supported housing that we have, which are available, which are or should be available. So I think the question is back to this pathway. How do we make sure that there is a plan in place for women when they leave prison into whichever form of accommodation might be appropriate, and that form of accommodation has to be right for their specific needs. It might be high needs, or it might be that they have low needs. But it's about how we get people, as well, commissioning more and better specialist and supported housing for the range of vulnerable groups that we need to commission for, and making sure that when women are leaving prison, they've got that pathway into it. The thing I would add is, I think it goes back to sort of Will's point on multiple needs. One thing that struck me when we visited Bronzefield was the statistics they gave on the proportion of the women there who are neurodivergent. I think 60%. And, you know, one of the points that was being made was perhaps if that issue had been addressed much earlier upstream, they wouldn't have actually ended up in prison in the first place. So I think there's a bit of, you know, this is not specific to housing, but a broader bit of work that needs to be done there as well.
I'm just going to push back on Will's point, saying that they're not. Yes, their needs won't be changed, but I think what we heard from visiting Bronzefield, and also a lot of evidence in this area, that women then leave prison. You know, their home would have been disrupted. They might have lost their children. They will struggle to get employment. They'll be experiencing stigma. I'm sure they will have a psychological impact of being in prison. So I get what you're saying, that the underlying needs that got them there wouldn't have changed, but I would say that they're in an incredibly vulnerable position on leaving prison.
Agreed.
And then, yeah, just my follow-up question I was going to ask later, but I spoke to someone who's a trustee at a centre in Hull for women affected by domestic abuse, and they acquire homes through social investment bonds. So I guess this is a question to Tom, because I'd be really interested if you're aware of these kind of models and if it's something that you've ever considered for this population of women, because there's over £10 billion available in social investments in 2023 that went to projects. So I'm just interested if that's something you've considered.
I have a feeling, I have a memory that the GLA might have been involved in social impact bonds in the past. I think possibly before I took up this post.
It was popular like 6 or 7 years ago.
It was. So I think I'd have to go back and look at that and perhaps then understand, why that didn't continue. But I'm not saying no. If there is genuinely money out there and we can make it work, we should look at it. So I think that's one for me to take back, discuss with our team, and
that's
come
brilliant.
Back to you about.
Because social impact bonds were talked about before, and I was going to come back to Will on my questions earlier about some of your programmes, because I wondered if you commission around social outcomes and if you have that kind of model of upfront investment around social impact.
So we don't take a sort of social impact bond investment type approach because we don't want a return that is financial. Sorry to be kind of really blunt, but when I've done social impact bonds before for things like homeschool travel for SEND pupils or I love a social impact bond. There's places where it's brill, but there's got to be a direct financial saving for it to make work to the investor. So for me, unfortunately, a CJS outcome has never been one that's been attractive enough to get that form of social investment into. Where I think it does, where I've seen it, where I think it's worked in housing, is then where effectively the housing. I understand the registered social landlord will then long lease it back to a domestic abuse safe accommodation provider. We've got bits like that in London, but the investments come from, say, Canadian Teachers Pension Fund. They're sort of, I don't know enough about the models, but I know that the providers don't always love them who end up in that provision. So I was with a domestic abuse provider in East London recently. They were talking about their lease, and we sort of got into it. The sort of requirement, I think, for return on that capital creates all kinds of perverse incentives. Sorry, I'm speaking well outside of my knowledge zone.
No, it's really helpful. I think you've answered the question well, and I think it is something that probably is worth looking at for these models that are working in different areas, and if it's something that we can, leverage here. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wanted to kind of follow up with all of you on that then. So what role, we'll start with Tom, what role do you think the GLA can play in convening between local authorities, housing associations and probation and prison release teams to ensure available housing provision for women leaving prison? Is there a greater role that could be played, basically?
So as we sort of touched on that, I think that's already going on. It's very much going on as a kind of collaborative process, particularly between the GLA and London councils as part of the wider work that we are doing on rough sleeping and homelessness. And I think it does need to be something that is sort of taken forward jointly, as it were, between ourselves and London councils, given the key statutory responsibilities that they hold. But I think Velvet has really already touched on the fact that a lot of work is going on that she's doing and others in the team are doing as well on this issue, thanks, as she says, in no small part due to John Plummer's fantastic advocacy.
Thank you. Assemblymember Baker.
Thank you, Chair. So I'm going to start with Tom, and his question is, housing related, obviously, but about working with the new government. So how are you going to work with the new government over this mayoral term to address the lack of suitable housing options and housing support for women leaving prison and their families?
Thank you. Yes, so like in other areas on housing and elsewhere, we're working closely with the government on this. So a couple of weeks ago, we hosted here at City Hall a round table relating to the plan of action, at which the probation service and the Home Office attended, which we're very pleased about. And we were also very pleased that the new Minister for Rough Sleeping and Homelessness, Rushanara Ali, attended and indeed attended for the whole meeting and engaged, really positively with the people in the room. And I'm very, very heartened by that. And I've got follow-up meetings with her, over the coming weeks to discuss the work on the plan of action more broadly. And of course, this sits as an important part of that.
Thanks. Velvet, Will, do you have anything to add
I
to
might
that?
just maybe put a pin in a couple of things that I think are really interesting at the moment in this space. So the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, said in one of her first speeches, actually, that work to address the needs of women in the criminal justice system, or at risk of the criminal justice system, is going to be a real emphasis of the government. And she announced a new body, the Women's Justice Board. Don't have a lot of information about that at the moment. As you can imagine, I'm quite like London to be represented, maybe the DMPC or depending on what level it's at. But we're really excited about that. So I think that's really important. Also, the Minister for Prisons and Probation, Lord Timpson, has said a lot on this topic as well in the past. I think there's loads for us to reach into here in our lobbying lines, and the new DMPC will be hopefully meeting the minister soon. He actually wrote, didn't he? The first two parts of your motion, he wrote in February 2024 in his role as the Prison Reform Trust to ask for those to be implemented nationally. So he clearly cares about this stuff too. So I think there's a real in there as well. So I think how can City Hall work better with government? Well, absolutely what the Deputy Mayor said. But there's the landscape's opening up for us. This feels like a really good time to be having these conversations.
But you're not aware yet what the scope of that board's going to be and how much it will get into the detail of the sort of things we're taking here.
I mean, not yet. I mean, from a pure, obviously not my job to do policy, but from a pure evidence point of view, clearly that and the sentencing review, I think, feel really important about short sentences and women. I think that feels really important, and a big step to, of that 500 at Bronzefield. 300 of those weren't in Bronzefield. That would be a big step, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, the question is, will the specific impact, specific interaction of the shorter sentences and the impact that has on stable housing, I hope that will then be brought into that. It's out of my area to understand how exactly we'd do that, but that information of just how much it then stops women putting their lives back together, I think is, hopefully that will be something that comes through. That wasn't a question, apologies. Sorry, Velvet, you...
No, I just wanted to add, kind of in addition to what Will has said, it's probably, and I know that the Housing Committee will understand this very well, but it's probably quite important just to zoom out slightly. During this conversation, we've spoken a lot about the statutory duties of boroughs. I'm sure there aren't very many housing officers within London boroughs who wish to deprive a woman who is vulnerable as a result of leaving prison a safe place to stay. A lot of the work that we're doing with London boroughs is to improve our joint working across London so that boroughs are better equipped to respond to this statutory duty. So what we'll be doing is making the case for London that London needs more resources to address this need, because women leaving prison are one of many vulnerable groups that we'll be looking to address. But I am sure, whilst we're talking about boroughs, I'm sure it's not in the interest of any borough housing officer to deprive these women or turn these women away.
No, and I think we certainly have had information earlier on and when we did the visit about the need for more specialists, more training, more people who really understand the nitty-gritty of why we're in this situation. So, understood. So, Tom, while we're talking about resources, how much funding has the Mayor requested from the new government to support his Housing First approach specifically?
We haven't. I was going to say we haven't made an approach specifically on housing first.
Yeah.
We're very pleased that the government has announced additional funding in the budget, which is going to go into rough sleeping more broadly, of which we can look at how we can take a housing first approach forward. So I think there's an extra £233 million, which takes spending next year on homelessness broadly to £1 billion, which is very, very welcome.
That's overall, isn't it? Do we know how much London will get?
That's overall. I don't think we can say yet quite how much London will get, but we are hoping very much for details in the coming weeks as to how that will be allocated.
So you're expecting money for homelessness overall, and then the mayor will decide how much then goes to Housing First.
So so what will happen is we will get funding for London through what was called the Rough Sleeping Initiative, RSI. I don't know if it's going to continue being called the RSI. And what that will mean for the coming year is that the services that we already commission will hopefully be able to continue, and then we'll be working through the comprehensive spending review on what a new settlement for London will be looking like.
And that's overall for housing, obviously.
That will be obviously the affordable homes programme element of that, and then there'll be the rough sleeping element of that and the broader homelessness element of that.
Yeah, because of course Housing First approach requires there to be the homes to put people in, isn't it? So is that one of the reasons that you wouldn't ask for a specific pot for Housing First? Because it needs to come both from homelessness work and also from having the social homes basically to put people in. Is that right?
We need the homes to put people in. So Housing First is for very high needs rough sleepers. Yeah. So it only works if you've got the funding to provide some quite intensive support work. What we are also looking to expand, though, is what was called Clearinghouse, which wasn't the most accessible name in the world, we're now calling Homes Off the Streets, and we are looking to work with our housing association partners to expand that. That would be what's called housing-led. And generally, it offers support to lower and medium needs rough sleepers. It was originally set up, I think, in the 90s by Louise Casey. It's been very successful, and we're looking to work with housing associations and particularly L&Q, who provide many of the units, to expand that housing-led service.
Fantastic. So just add on to that, and then I'm just going to go back to that question about Housing First, because I'm still not quite there. So in the new Homes Off the Streets programme, what provision will there be specifically for women?
So it's general needs. So there will be support there for women rough sleepers as well as part of the broader programme.
Yeah,
it's
but
not
I think
specifically.
I know, but I think the whole thrust of this investigation, in case you haven't picked it up, is that women's needs specifically when leaving prison are not being picked up. How is that going to be?
Homes Off the Streets to be as accessible for women as possible, and as part of the plan of action work, we can take that forward in terms of what is the best way to strengthen those links in terms of a pathway for women into what was called Clearinghouse. So
you're going to take that away and have a look at how that can be specifically.
It's a very important part of what we're doing.
Fantastic. And going back to Housing First, so Housing First is an approach, absolutely correct approach, but does it at the moment have a pot of money associated with it, or is it using the money that you have across Affordable Homes programme and the homelessness money to deliver that? Is that correct?
Yeah,
does it have figures associated with it?
So I'd say two things about that. Firstly, we funded Housing First projects through our SHAP programme, and I don't have figures in front of me, but I'm very confident that we can send the committee, details of what's been funded and how much funding has been allocated.
SHAP. It's through the homelessness programme.
It's been funded through SHAP. Unfortunately, there was a Housing First pilot a few years ago. Unfortunately, London was not given any funding for that. I know, what a surprise. Other parts of the country were, London was not. But we have funded some Housing First schemes through SHAP. Yeah. What I would say more broadly about Housing First, I think Housing First is important. It has to be part of and this is something lots of people in the sector will say as well, it has to be part of a suite of a sort of toolkit, as it were, that includes other forms of supported housing. But it is an important part for particularly high needs rough sleepers.
Yeah. Okay. Velvet.
No, I just wanted to come in with reference to the specific accommodation for ex-offenders as part of the wider budget that was announced recently. So we will be looking to understand from that 233 million what proportion of that it will be a small proportion of that will be allocated to the AFIO programme. So that's the accommodation for ex-offenders programme, which boroughs have to bid for. So eligibility to bid is based on indices of multiple deprivation, and the funding is tenancy support, basically, so to accommodate ex-offenders within the private rental sector. But we'll be keeping an eye out for what the announcement is as to whether or not this funding continues, because it's due to end in March 2025. But we understand that the funding that was announced in the budget, some of that will be ring-fenced for that accommodation scheme, AFIO.
Okay, and hopefully we'll then get some of that. And will there then be some specificities about how that deals with women ex-offenders specifically? I've said specifically twice.
So I haven't got the gender breakdown as to how AFIO currently works, and the GLA, unlike RSI or RSAP, the GLA doesn't receive its own pot of funding. Boroughs receive the funding. But I can come back to you on the borough breakdown of how people are supported through AFIO. I suspect it will still be majority men.
I mean, it's obviously going to be majority men, but the question is not the bald numbers, but with the smaller number of women, is the support that they're given or the work that's done with them specific to their needs, or is it just generalised across people in prison overall? Because if so, it's not going to give the right support. Because, look, by its very nature, if the majority of men, if you don't do it specifically for women, it's going to be designed for the men. So that's the question, and I think that would be something to come back on, if that's okay, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Assembly Member Garbett.
Thank you. Some of this has been touched on, but I'll just give you an opportunity to answer this in specifically. So to Tom, the Mayor made a commitment to preventing and addressing homelessness in his 2024 election manifesto, and he stated that he would end rough sleeping for good. Quotes. The Mayor also agreed in 2022 that he would acknowledge the differences in needs and risks of women leaving prison compared to men. So my question is, how will the Mayor support preventative work to help women leaving prison avoid homelessness and the risk of becoming rough sleepers?
Yeah, thank you for that, Assembly Member Garbett. So the key word there in what you said is prevention. And as part of the plan of action work, we are very much looking at how we can move our interventions upstream into a more preventative space. The Mayor's rough sleeping services are absolutely fantastic. They help people off the streets quickly and effectively, and 85% of people who are helped off the streets are not seen rough sleeping again. But they are an emergency response in the main. And actually, what we really want to get to a position of is preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place. That is much more complicated. Many, if not most, of the levers are not in the hands of the Mayor. They are in the hands of often the government or other organisations. But the whole point of the plan of action work and, you know, the work we will do feeding into what the government and London councils are doing on homelessness more broadly is to look at the whole system, take a strategic view and see how we can move upstream whilst making sure that we don't compromise on the emergency response services that are needed when people do end up on the streets. So, you know, that is going to be absolutely crucial.
So then just in the action plan, so that sounds really good. Just in the action plan, is this, so women leaving prison as a cohort, are they specifically spoken about in terms of their needs in preventing homelessness?
Well, obviously the action plan hasn't been written, but in terms of the work that's going on, there'll be a key strand of that, which is looking, you know, in general at people who are leaving institutions like prisons, and then specifically at what the needs of women are as part of that.
Great, because it sounds like obviously we've all been talking about things to properly prevent women entering the criminal justice system, you know, things like you mentioned around neurodiversity and the kind of refuge spaces, and hopefully it will really speak to all of those issues for women. Thank you. Can I ask a quick question while I'm here? Just from something we heard earlier, I was just going to ask maybe Tom or Will what the Mayor or MOPAC's thoughts are and links will be to the new Women's Justice Board that's been set up.
Do you want to cover that, Will?
Yeah, I'll say that one. I mean, I talked about just briefly a second ago with Assembly Member Baker, didn't I? We're trying really hard to figure out what's on that board. I have a feeling that, I don't know if I should say this really, Obviously, we know who the chief advisor to the Justice Secretary is. So we're hoping that might give us an in to getting on that board and certainly getting representation into it. There's a lot we think that board can do. I mean, I've touched on some of it already, and the fact it might be quite exciting.
Thank you very much. Will, you had the last word there. So I'd like to thank the three of you for your contributions in that second panel. You're welcome to stay, or we're going to wrap up in about 2-3 minutes. So can we note the report and today's discussion? Noted. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Can we note the committee's work programme and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, the site visit to HMP Bronzefield?
Noted.
The date of the next meeting of the committee is 12th of December 2024 at 2 p.m. in the chamber at City Hall. I have no urgent business and I declare this meeting closed.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater